I'm Geoff Cowan. I'm the Dean of the Annenberg School, and on behalf of our school and also the Armory, I want to welcome you all here to this very, very special evening. Howard Buffett is a remarkable figure in my mind for many things. He's about to go back home to Decatur, Illinois, to engage in his first passion, which is farming. He has an 840-acre farm in Decatur. He grows corn and soybeans, and with great pride, he has just bought a new combine with which he is going to be harvesting.
Great objections from my wife.
But besides being a wonderful farmer, being a very successful business executive with many different enterprises, being an elected leader in a Board of Supervisors at one time, a member of the National Debate Commission. By the way, Howie, today they announced that your debates, I think they picked the whole slate. They've gone along with the whole slate of Howie's Debate Commission, which is quite a triumph today. And he's also a philanthropist who has supported many important causes and has actually been awarded the Aztec Eagle Award by the President of Mexico. I think it's the highest award that they give to a foreign citizen. So Howie's done a lot of different things, but I think nothing that he has done compares to the artistry and the passion of the pictures that we're about to see. And as those of you who know his work are aware, it's a story that his pictures tell a story, and it's a story that is transformative once you see those pictures. Many of us were privileged to just now be at the exhibit, which we're happy we're going to have on display for the next few months. And a number of other people who were here asked if they could take the exhibit to their universities in other parts of the state and the country. And I'm certain that this will continue to travel. But for us, it's particularly wonderful to have you here, Howie, to talk about your photos and to talk about what they tell us all about the world. Thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming Howard Buffett.
Thanks, Geoff. Oh, I got to turn on. Oh, I am on. That was pretty exciting. Somebody turned me on from not here, up there. Well, before I get too serious, I'm going to take advantage of this situation and tell you a little story about Geoff that he doesn't know. And I reminded him he had to have a sense of humor tonight. But I was coming back from London last Monday or Tuesday, and I said that I was going to be at USC and that the friend was a dean of the communication school and invited me to come speak. And the guy on the plane looked a little puzzled. He says, well, what's a dean really do? And I said, well, that's a little hard to describe at times, but I said, let me try to do that. So I'm going to recite kind of the description I gave because I thought it's kind of an appropriate opportunity to do it. There's a gentleman who wanted to buy a parrot. So this gentleman went down to a very reputable pet store, went in and found the salesman and told him that he was looking to buy a parrot. And he says, well, we're there in the back section, just follow me. So he goes to the back section and he says, now here's one of our finer parrots here. And he says, this parrot does a lot of things. And the guy that wants to buy it says, well, what's he actually do? And he says, well, believe it or not, this parrot cooks, he does dishes, counts backwards from 100, and trades derivatives. And this guy says, wow, that's impressive. He says, you got to know, though, the parrot's about $2,500. He says, yeah, but that's a lot of parrot. So he says, what about the one next to him? And the salesman says, well, I don't know, that might be out of your league. And he says, why? He says, well, he costs $5,000. And he says, well, what's he do for $5,000? He says, well, he does everything the first one does. He answers the phone. He irons, speaks 5 foreign languages, recites the Greek alphabet backwards, has an MBA from Caltech and a PhD from USC. And the guy says, well, I mean, for that kind of money, I mean, that might be a bargain. And then he says, now what about this third parrot over here kind of by himself? And the guy shook his head, the salesman shook his head. He says, no. He's completely out of your league. And he says, why? He says, that parrot costs $25,000. The guy says, wow, I can't imagine what that parrot does. And the salesman says, well, he kind of scratches his head. And he says, I've never seen that parrot do anything, but they call him Dean. Oh, you found me something. Okay. All right. This is in case I get all choked up. It's a Coca-Cola product. I want everyone to know that. When Jeff asked me to come here to Los Angeles to do this, or when we discussed it, I kind of thought about the different experiences that I had, and I guess I'm going to make sure this works, because I'll tell you one thing that I did was I got here, and I've created a nightmare for everyone here in the logistical team. I went from slides to a PowerPoint back to slides, so hopefully it all works. But I kind of started to think about different things, and I kind of started to recall in my mind, a lot of different stories that have to do with my photography, kind of like a movie. I was on Rewind, and I thought about trips like when I was arrested in Bosnia, or when I was chased by a polar bear in Canada, and I'm probably lucky I wasn't killed. And then I thought a little bit more about it, and I thought, really, it makes more sense for me to focus on the human element of life and the kind of images that I've tried to capture that have to do with what goes on around the world that are so conveniently forgotten by those of us who really are not impacted by them. So I thought back, and I was in Omaha. This goes back a couple of years ago. I was getting ready to go to India, and a friend of mine, I was having dinner with a friend of mine, Galiani, and she started kind of giving me a hard time, and she says, I sure don't understand why you go all over the world and take these photographs, and everybody knows the statistics, everybody knows what the figures are and the numbers, and so what's the difference? And I thought about that, and at first it I thought, well, maybe she's right, but I don't give up that easily. And then as I thought a little bit more about it, I realized, when I take a photograph, I never think of an individual as a statistic. There's no photograph I've ever taken in my life as I'm photographing an individual that I think of them as a statistic. So it made me think that, maybe the answer to dealing with what her challenge or her question was really to put a human face with each one of those statistics. And that's really what this presentation is about, with the purpose of trying to put a person with a number that makes it more realistic and has some kind of a different value than just reading a number or hearing a number. And it kind of reminded me of a story, and there's probably many of you that have heard this short story by Lauren Isley. But there was a man who would go to the ocean to do his writing, and he had a habit of walking on the beach before he would begin his work. One day he was walking along the shore, and he looked down the beach, and he saw a human figure moving. As he got closer, he saw a young man who was bending down and picking something up and gently throwing it into the ocean. As he got closer, he called out, "Good morning, young man. What are you doing?" The young man paused, looked up, and replied, "Throwing starfish into the ocean." "I guess I should have asked, why are you throwing starfish into the ocean?" The young man said, "The sun's coming up, the tide's going out. If I don't throw them in, they'll all die." "But young man, don't you realize there are miles and miles of beach and starfish all along? You can't possibly make a difference." And the young man listened politely, then bent down, picked up another starfish, threw it into the sea, past the breaking waves, and looked at the man and said, "It made a difference for that one." Well, earlier I made the point that my conversation with a friend kind of made me think twice about what comments I'd make today. But the other thing that made me think about it was my trip to India, which was just a few days after that discussion. Everywhere I looked, there are thousands of people living in conditions that really you and I cannot hardly imagine, and most of us probably very likely couldn't survive. Now, we can look at a photograph, but we cannot and will never live the experience. It's difficult to replicate in an image the pain, the frustration, the fear, the sadness, or the anger that exists because of circumstances that happen to be beyond your control. I cannot adequately relate to you the constant level of noise in the city or the smell. Sometimes the stench is so bad that I can't even breathe normally when I'm taking photographs. The air is full of dirt, your eyes burn. Sometimes they ache so badly you can hardly keep them open. And I'm only there for minutes, maybe an hour, maybe a few hours. And many of the people you're going to see tonight live in those conditions. And that causes a feeling of insignificance that I think begins as a human being to just kind of wear you down. And those living in this kind of a situation, I think, become kind of reduced to an existence that's really is less than the human spirit was ever meant to endure. Now, all my life, I've kind of heard my dad tell different stories, and one of them that has always stuck in my mind is something that he calls the ovarian lottery. The concept that we could be born in America or Bangladesh, we could be born black or white, we could be born rich or poor, we could have parents that cared about us, parents that didn't care about us. You could be born in a country where hard work paid off, or you could be born in a country where you could work as hard as you could and you could get nowhere. And that reminded me again then of something that I saw a few years ago called the Summary of the World. And I probably, if I were I'm technically challenged, I'll tell you that right now. It's hard, it's a challenge for me just to get the cell phone right. So I don't use a computer, believe it or not. And if I did, I could probably get a little updated number. So I apologize if these are a little bit old, but this was a summary of the world that I found a few years ago. And I thought I would read it to you because it has a lot to do with some of what you're going to see tonight. Out of 100 people, 57 would be Asians, 21 Europeans, 14 from the Western Hemisphere, including North and South America, and 8 from Africa. 51 would be female and 49 would be male. 70 would be non-white, 30 would be white. 66 would be non-Christian and 33 would be Christian. 80 would live in substandard housing. 70 would be unable to read. Half would suffer from malnutrition. 1 would be near death, 1 would be near birth. Only 1 would have a college education. Half the entire village's wealth would be in the hands of only 6 people, and all 6 people would be from the United States. Now, it's obvious from those numbers that our chances were not all that great that we'd end up in America, the wealthiest country in the world. Therefore, I think it's very safe to say that everyone in this room has had the winning lottery ticket. The ones you're going to see tonight are the ones that lost. Back in India, as I left some of the worst slums in the world and returned to my hotel room where I had clean water and hot water and a telephone, room service, refrigerator full of candy bars and drinks, and a safe and secure and comfortable bed, it becomes difficult to reconcile the two worlds that you're living in. One when you're out photographing and one when you come back and just put it all behind you by closing a door. My message today comes from those memories that I still carry with me from many of those different trips. It's a sobering message, but it's the reality for the far majority of the world's citizens. So yes, I would say we have all heard the statistics, and we're all aware of what they are. But like the little boy with the starfish, I'm going to take each one by one, and put a face with these overused, impersonal statistics that are basically meaningless to us because we're unaffected by them in our life. However, these are faces that make up most of the dramatic part of life. Now, some of the photographs may be disturbing, but that's the point. And if you think they're disturbing on a screen, you ought to see them when you're taking them in person. And the challenge is sometimes getting these photographs is that it's very easy to feel as if you're an intruder, stepping in and out of someone's life for a minute or a few seconds, because they don't have the luxury of stepping out of their life and coming home with me. A few of us in this room can imagine what it's like to live day after day in conditions that are unacceptable for human existence, where hope slips away and you wake each day by fear and the unknown, where you're exploited and become numb to the world because it's the only way you can survive. So I'm going to start with a statistic that probably is one that most of us hear the most often. And I'm going to see if I can get this to work now. Okay, I'm in trouble. There we go. Thank you. It's a good thing you're paying attention. And that's 1.2 billion people live on less than $1 a day. Now, this is Ciprian, who probably lives more like on 25 cents a day. You can see he lost his leg when he was about 10 years old. He lost his leg on a railroad track. You can see the opening of the sewer behind him. That's where he lives. That's his home, along with about 8 or 9, 10 other children in that particular place. And there's many others across Bucharest that are the same. He's sniffing glue one to pass the time and one to try to get past the pain that he experiences. So Ciprian kind of represents everything I'm going to talk about tonight. He talks about those who live on less than $1 a day. He represents those who don't have health care. He represents those who don't have a home. So he really is a pretty representative figure in terms of the statistics that I'm going to try to relay to you. And so this is one face that goes with somebody who lives for less than $1 a day. Now, to put this in some perspective, I was sitting in the hotel last night before I went to dinner at Jeff's, and I picked the phone up and I asked the operator, I said, if I want to call an area code within the LA, a different area code, but within the LA region, what does it cost per minute? It costs $1.25 a minute from the hotel to call. So this young man could probably live almost a week on what it costs to make one phone call from that hotel for a minute. And that's a pretty significant thing if you look at how our lifestyle is and those that live in a situation like this. $1 a day can mean that you live by depending on someone else for your food, that you're not self-sufficient. It can mean that you depend on family members in a way that we probably don't even comprehend because they're the only ones you can turn to in a difficult time. It can mean despair, frustration, fear. This little boy, I would guess by the experiences that we saw him have and by trying to talk to him, this little boy goes to bed scared every night and he gets up every morning scared because he doesn't know what's in front of him. It can mean that you don't have any clothes. So it can also mean this girl is in Romania, and as I look at that photograph, it represents to me that it means that you can be a very lonely person because you don't have anyone around you that has the time to care for you or the time to listen to what you think or what your dreams might be. It probably means it's very hard to have dreams. So living on $1 a day can mean a lot of different things, and I'm sure none of us can quite really understand the impact of that every day. And then there's about 2.7 billion people, about close to half the population, not quite, the world, that live on less than $2 a day. Now this young boy, he's going through a garbage dump looking for probably one of two things, either something to eat or, and we did see kids that would get items out of the garbage and eat them, or he's looking for something that he can sell, hoping that that will get him something for the day that he wouldn't otherwise have. It obviously means, and you see this all over the world, that that you're humbled, that you have to beg to take care of your child or to take care of yourself. Now there's about 1 billion people in the world that go to bed hungry. This is at a feeding center which actually had no food at the time in northern Ghana. And we talked to a number of the women that were there, and finally you could get most of them to smile. You could certainly get all of them to talk to you. This woman, no matter what you said to her, she never looked at you. She never changed her expression. She had this expression for 30 minutes while we tried to talk to her. And what it meant to me was absolute despair and probably absolutely no hope. And some of the children there obviously were used to going to bed hungry, and they were there looking at us with some kind of hope that we could provide something for them. And that's probably one of the most difficult things when you're taking photographs like this, is that you know the incredible wealth and abundance that you have at home, that you absolutely can't convey one bit of that into this environment because it isn't, that's not where it is, and you can't get it there. There's about 30,000 children a day that die in developing countries, many from malnutrition, some from contaminated water. Now, that's about 1,250 children an hour or 21 each minute. I mean, that's a phenomenal number if you think about it. And as you view this image, the reality is that in the next 2 days, more people are going to starve to death than the amount of people who were instantly killed in Hiroshima. Now, there's two kinds of malnutrition, and I'm not an expert on this, but one type is just simply from inadequate protein intake, and the other type is one where the body begins to use all of the muscle and any of the fat as energy just to reserve and maintain the vital functions such as breathing and heartbeat. Now, there's about 2 billion people who live without access to clean water, and I chose this image because I thought it was particularly interesting that you have this woman washing her child out of a pond. At the same time, you can't quite see it all, but there were about 5 cattle that were standing in the same water drinking, and at other times defecating. So there's also about 1.3 billion people who live without clean drinking water. And this is one of the most significant, I've learned over a little bit of time as I've traveled with Angela Mason, and she's taken me to some of these places, just how significant this issue is. This is not something I understood 2 or 3 years ago, but there's a number of things that happen when you don't have clean drinking water, and one of them is you ingest a guinea worm, and it's probably a bacteria type. I probably won't get that right either, but it's ingested into your system through the water. And this is the worm that the doctor is trying to pull out of the foot here. And I remember the very first time I photographed it, I walked into a room and the doctor had his arm up here, and I thought he was stitching something. But that was the length of the worm that he was pulling out of a little boy's ankle that was about 12 years old. Now, this is a foot of a girl who's been in school all day. And when I photographed this, I just could not imagine my kids having to go to school with this kind of an injury, thinking that they could learn anything, that they could concentrate on anything, let alone all of the other health risks that come with it. There's also a number of other things that come along with contaminated water, such as trachoma and river blindness and elephantiasis. And I was actually trying to get a picture of this child in a little different position to compare his leg to the individual with the elephantiasis, and she got, I think it's a he, I can't always tell, got so scared of me with the camera that he started to cry, so we couldn't really get a great photograph, but it does show the kind of difficulty that, I mean, you can imagine the pain and the difficulty of moving around, and obviously then that takes a great impact on your ability to make a living for yourself or provide for a family or anything else. There's about 2.4 billion people that live without adequate sanitation. Now, I can count about a dozen children in this picture, and as I got out to take this picture, I was on a bridge in Mumbai, and the guy who was with us had a nickname. He was Bags, and Bags turned around and says, "Now be careful when you get out." And more often, someone says that to me when we're in an area where there's landmines or something pretty dangerous. And I thought I couldn't imagine what he meant. And I opened the door, and between the car to about where that Annenberg sign is where I wanted to go to photograph. And it was almost impossible to walk from here to there without stepping in human waste. And so then, as I opened the door, I realized what he meant. And of course, this is a pretty humiliating situation when you don't have any opportunity to have any privacy or to go or do whatever it is that you need to, and you just you have no way of getting any privacy. There's about 100 million people that live with absolutely no housing. And it's funny because after I was talking to a few people, I realized there's some of the photographs that I've taken in other parts of the world you could probably take right here in L.A. They might not look exactly the same. But, you know, this is a number of people living along a street in India, and this is all they own. This is their housing. And a photograph here of a young child with his brother, and this is where they sleep every single night. And this is a photograph where in India I got up one morning and I read in the newspaper where the government had taken large four-wheel drive wheel loaders and just leveled about 2 or 3 miles of housing, temporary housing that had been set up. And so I wanted to go there, asked the driver to take me there, and he did. And there were a number of people, I mean, that just were in complete despair, didn't know what to do. And I took this photograph of this child. And quite honestly, I would imagine she's alive, but she was in all of the rubble that had just been completely decimated by these machines. There's about 1.5 billion people who lack adequate housing or live in slums. And I just have a couple of different pictures here of the different kinds of slums. And what you have to remember is that obviously you have no electricity, you have no power of any kind. You're probably burning firewood within your home to try to cook or to stay warm. Obviously here you're going to discard all of your waste into the water system. So 1.5 billion people living in those kind of conditions with a tremendous impact on not just themselves but on the environment around them. There's about 2.8 billion people, or half the world's population, have no access or basically just no health care. And this is a little boy in Ethiopia, and we tried to talk to his mother through a translator to better understand what was wrong with him. And she really couldn't even tell us his age, except that for about the last 4 to 5 years, which was her best estimate, that he hadn't been able to move his arms or legs. And then in Ghana, you can barely see in the very lower right-hand corner, as you look at the image, the hand of a woman who is the mother of this child who has malaria, malnutrition, and meningitis. And she knew very well that her daughter was going to die within the next few days. And this is one time where I went to the other end of the hospital, if you want to call it that, and absolutely really couldn't photograph. There was a boy there with malnutrition worse than I'd ever seen, and his parents were there, and he was probably in the very last few hours. And it's one of the few times I just put my camera down and walked out because it was just too difficult to photograph. All across the world, you see deformities and kids, adults who deal with them, realizing that if these people had access to health care or probably lived in this country, they would have been able to resolve a lot of it before it became so bad. Leprosy is something we don't even think about, but you can find plenty of people across the globe who deal with it. This is a little girl who would be considered an internally displaced person, who was sleeping in not much of a tent, but a tent. And during the night, if you look at the hand with the white kind of cream on it, a rat ate off 2 of her fingers. And this was the best they could do to try to help this child. That was all that was available. And of course, something that many people forget about, and that is those who deal with the mentally ill or mental conditions. And obviously, in most parts of the world, there is nowhere for these people either to be cared for or taken care of or kept off the streets. This is a boy who we drove past him, and first I thought he was dead, and we tried to back up, and it was very difficult to back up because of the traffic. We got backed up, and I've learned in a lot of places you don't want to get out of the vehicle, so we tried to get somebody's attention to find out what was going on. And this was a boy who had seizures from time to time. It was about 100 degrees out this day, so they laid him down on the concrete in the shade where they can find it, and they lay him down face down so he can't choke on his tongue, and then they come throw water on him about every 30 or 45 minutes just to keep him from getting completely overheated in the conditions that he was in. Now, there's also about a third of the world's population, believe it or not, almost 2 billion people, who are infected with tuberculosis, which is considered by many the biggest comeback infectious disease in history. And it kills about 3 million people a year. Now, I'm not quite hitting this right. And obviously, one that everybody's familiar with is that, there's well over 40 million people that are infected with HIV. And this picture is taken the way it is because I took it in a hospital in a small town in Bangladesh where if the other people knew that this was an AIDS patient, he would be taken out and abandoned somewhere because of the kind of the kind of fear that goes with AIDS and the lack of education. And so I had to be a little bit discreet in how I took it. And of course, the next wave that the world's going to get hit with in terms of the impact of HIV is the almost 15 million orphan children already from those parents who have had HIV, and that number will, of course, grow as quickly as the rest. There's about 70,000 people that are estimated to have polio in the world today, something that probably should have been completely eradicated a long time ago and almost was. And then the diseases that we really have pretty much forgotten about in this country, whether it's hepatitis A, hepatitis B, yellow fever, typhoid, meningitis. They're killing children, people, but mainly children every day throughout the world. 1 million children a year die from malaria. And there's 80 countries in the world today that are epidemic with cholera. And there's about 250 million school-age children that are child laborers. And that's 1 out of about every 6 children in the world today. And obviously you can imagine the conditions that these children work in, and you can see the pain on her face. And then you can see these young little kids. I mean, some of them are probably not more than 3 or 4 years old, and this is when they start their labor, helping their parents who might make only a few pennies a day. And something that seems a little bit unrealistic to us probably in this world as we go through a regular day in our life is that when you talk about slavery. But there's about 30 million, close to 30 million people is estimated that live in some kind of slavery. Now, they can be bought and sold, they may be held captive, they may just be exploited in some form for profit, or they're victims of a culture. And I'm going to talk about why this little boy, this young boy, is in shackles. And here's another boy from the situation. And you look at the shackles that are on his ankles. They're about an inch thick, and he's also chained. If you can see the chain around the tree, it goes around his waist. I'm going to talk about these 2 young men at the very end of the presentation. But you can also define slavery a lot of ways, and you know, it can even be a culture where the human dignity and individual rights just simply don't exist. This woman is carrying salt on the top of her head. I doubt I could lift that up. That's wet salt in that container. She's got a baby on her back. She went back and forth. We sat there and photographed her for probably about an hour and a half, maybe longer. And she does this for 12 hours a day, probably about 7 days a week, get paid 70 cents a day, and she gives all her money to her husband. Now, you can define that any way you want, but I don't think that any of us would accept that in our lives. So to me, it's another form of slavery. There's about 10 million children that are involved in prostitution, you know, almost none of them by choice. And oftentimes they're sometimes sold by their parents because it's a way to get money that they can't get otherwise. And I want to stop and just say for a minute, Angela is here, will recognize Mohair. This is in Timbuktu. I never knew where Timbuktu was until I learned it was in Mali. And Angela said, one day we're going to Mali. And I said, okay, and we went. And you know, this is a story. Her story is something that's so representative of so many women and young girls across the world. In the Islam religion that's practiced where she is, a man can arrive in the evening and say, I want to marry you. And then he sleeps with the woman, and he gets up and he has to say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And he no longer has any obligation to the woman, and he leaves. And believe me, it leaves a lot of women pregnant. And she's one of the victims of this kind of culture. And so we went to the Timbuktu Women's Center, and there were, I don't know, Angela would remember, probably about 50 or 60 women there, and they teach them how to sew and a number of other, they try to teach them some kind of skill so that they can go out in the world and earn a living and get themselves out of this cycle. And she just struck me as somebody, because we photographed her outside of Timbuktu, which they refer to as the belt of misery, and I've never forgotten that. And these are definitely people that live on about 25 or 50 cents a day. And I photographed her because she caught my eye. And the next day when we went to the Women's Center, she was one of the individuals that was in the Women's Center, and that's how we sat down and talked to her and got her story. So, you know, for probably $100 or $200 or maybe $300 of some kind of capital investment in some kind of in these women who need that when they leave, you know, they have some way to at least mobilize themselves up from probably about the worst situation that if you could find yourself in if you were someone who's about 18 years old like she is. So child prostitution to me, you know, I oftentimes personalize it with 4 daughters, and I think, you know, I can't imagine what it would be like to think that my 13 or 12 or 11-year-old daughter is out with some man because it's the only way that they can make $1 or $2 or $5. There's about 25 million people that are internally displaced, spread across about 50 countries, and this woman has every bit of her belongings, whether right there and she's just had to pick up and leave. And almost all the time that you see this, it's a result of some kind of small arms conflict, war, regional war, something that's happening completely beyond their control. There's about 20 million, actually these are internally displaced people in India, just to give you an idea. And then there's about 20 million refugees that exist at any given time. And I'm not so sure that that number isn't low, but it's always hard to get accurate statistics. And when you look at this camp, you have to imagine the impact that that has, not just on the individuals, but the environment. I was in Rwanda one time, and we went by a refugee camp that had been left over from the war in '94, and well, really the war, but the genocide. And there was hills and hills and hills behind this camp, and I can't remember the name of the forest, but Annette told me, she said, well, this is such and such forest. And I said, well, it doesn't look like a forest to me. There's not a single tree. And she said that within 2 years they had cut down, and I forget how many thousands of hectares it was. So when you see a camp like this, it isn't just, the short term is obviously the impact that it has on the people, and the long term impact is on the environment, and then how in the world do you have any sustainable situation? So I wanted to also just show you this camp from the air, and then take you down below on the ground. This is on the Chad-Sudan border, taken in June, and this was a camp that was designed to hold 6,000 people, and it currently had, when we left, 15,000 people. And the morning that we went through, on the last day, there had been about 400 to 500 new people that had arrived. And to me, I mean, from a logistics standpoint, I don't know how people can possibly deal with it. It seems that it would be extremely difficult. And then, of course, even though I could have put this under the healthcare section, I put it here because this is a child that was photographed in this camp. And, I mean, this is just one of tens of thousands of little children that just don't have a chance in life. I mean, there isn't any way that I could have gone back there 2 days later and found this little guy alive and just laying in the sand. So, I mean, when you think about the impact of the refugee situation, it's about people, it's about the environment, it's about the health, and it's about the suffering of all those that are involved in it. Now, there's about 20,000 people a year that are either injured or killed by landmines. And one of the things that, when I was taking this photograph, I asked permission, and I was photographing this guy. He's a former soldier in Bosnia, and he was working on the parallel bars. And the one thing I wasn't prepared for, when he sat down, he took his leg off. And it may not seem that much sitting here looking at a photograph, but when you're sitting or standing a few feet away and somebody just takes their limb off their body, I mean, it has an impact on you because it's not natural. And it makes you realize how easily that can happen. There's about 300,000 children that are estimated to be engaged in wars all across, many of them in Africa. And one of the things that, as I was looking for statistics, I read that as the weapons become lighter, obviously they're able to get younger children to fight in the wars, and oftentimes they're also drugged. Now these were the most recent figures I could find. I'm sure they're not very accurate today, but the United Nations identified in their most recent report that I could find 28 civil war conflicts or wars that are affecting 60 million people across the world. Now, you know, we watch the Persian Gulf or the Gulf War, the Iraq War, or whatever, and, you know, they have smart bombs and they have laser-guided missiles and they have shock and awe campaigns and all these things that we see on CNN. But I can tell you, you know, most of that's really a warped sense of what's going on in the world, because the 60 million people that I'm talking about live in areas where 80% of the casualties are civilians, and many times, although men are included, but many times women and children. And so, you know, you have these tribal conflicts, and you'll have territorial conflicts. You'll have conflicts where corrupt governments are trying, and corrupt leaders are simply trying to enhance their own wealth. Now, this woman is in the camp that's very close to the Sudan border with no tents. They're living under trees. What she's describing with her arm or hand is the helicopters that drop bombs on their villages, and then the men would come in behind on horses and they would rape the women, they would kill the men, and those who could escape would escape. And of course, the one thing that's meant to me that was significant, being there in June and reading the newspapers, is a loose net rebel group doesn't have helicopters. So anybody who doesn't believe that the government isn't supporting this, it has to be, I think, ignorant of what the facts are. And then it's always amazing to me. This is Bosnia. When you think about how in 1984, this is a country that had the Olympics, and in 1992 they had so many people to bury in 93 and 94, 95 that they had to turn. This is not your normal cemetery. This is a soccer field that was used in the Olympics, and they turned the soccer field into a graveyard because they had so many people die so fast that they had nowhere else to bury them. Now, I went back and started around World War II, about 1940, and tried to add up the statistics that I could, and I didn't pay a lot of attention to the technical definition of genocide or ethnic cleansing. And what I could come up with was that there's been about 42 million human beings that have been killed in genocide or ethnic cleansing, or however you want to define it. And it's always amazing to me that you can have this kind of thing take place, because it has just got to be the most crude activity that one human being can inflict on another. And this woman here, and I actually met her again. I took this photograph about 4 years ago, and I met her again about 3 weeks ago in Rwanda and visited with her. And they've cleaned this church up some, but this is a woman who was hoarded into a church, being promised that if she went into the church it would be a safe haven. They locked the doors, which was a common practice during the genocide, and would fire in indiscriminately through the windows with semi-automatic weapons, and then throw grenades in. And then they would go in and finish them off with machetes, anybody who was alive. She laid under her dead husband and dead 3 children for a full day before she was willing to try to move, and she was about one of 4 to 5 survivors in this situation. Now, there's one statistic, and then I'm done trying to put faces with statistics. There's one statistic that in some way doesn't even have a face, but in another way has, to me, a million faces, and that is that in 1992, the contribution of development aid from the top 15 donors was about $73 billion. And in 2002, 10 years later, it was $53 billion, so $20 billion less, or close to 25%. So the way I see that is, here we are at home becoming wealthier, and we've decided somehow amongst ourselves that it's less important to support those people that you've seen on this screen and the many other millions that are along with them. Now, whenever I go to a part of the world where I see and take these photographs, they seem so foreign in the sense that you'd never see them here at home. And the truth is that if we had these kind of numbers and statistics at home, we wouldn't accept them. We would label it a crisis, and we would do something about it. But we don't do it because they don't impact us, they don't affect us, they aren't part of our life. Now, few of you would have known this, except Jeff told you, that at home I farm about 800 acres. And one of the things I always remember my dad telling me about farming was how bad it was, or how terrible a business it was, because primarily all you're doing is producing a commodity. Of course, the commodity, it has no distinguishing characteristics, so in the end it really has very little value. Well, very few of us would ever consider ourselves, any of us in this room, a commodity. We would be able to define different characteristics about ourselves and hopefully have goals and values, things that would make us different and unique amongst each other. But in the world today, there are millions of people that are really just that, and they are commodities. And they're commodities in the sense that they're a result of child labor, poverty, forced prostitution, war, enslavement, whatever category you want to pick. They really have, no future and no hope. Now, the real question in the end, and the question that I'm going to go back and try to answer in terms of where I started, which was, why does anybody else go take photographs of this nature, and why am I standing here tonight? And that is the question, can photographs really make a difference? Can they make people behave differently? Can they move a country to action? Do they move people to action? Do they change behavior? I mean, that's the question. And I think they can, and I think they do. And I'm just going to give you 2 examples. And one is in Senegal. And it goes back to the boys, the two young men that you saw, the one chained to the tree and the other one with the shackles on his ankles. We were in Senegal with a man named Mansour, who was a Muslim who worked for World Vision, and we were in a little town. And as we were in the town, he mentioned to Angela and I, he said, there's a child prison here, basically. And we both told him, you got to get us in there. We want to see it. And I said, I want to photograph it. And he says, it'll never happen. But we pushed him hard, and he had a conversation with somebody there. And as he described what was going on, it was kind of amazing to me, because what this prison was a result of, in Senegal, you might have, in particular areas, you would have a man who would have 4 or 5 wives. They might have 20 or 25 children. They might have 4 or 5 children, 2 or 3 children, whatever, that they don't want. So they give them to the marabout, who is the religious leader. And that religious leader then owns those children. And what happens is he sends them out to collect money, begging on the corners. And if they don't reach a quota that they have, then they're beat and they're locked up when they come back. Obviously, some of these kids try to escape when they have the opportunity. Those are the kids that you saw in the shackles and the chains. So we said, you've got to get us in there. We want to see it. He got us in there, and we weren't in there 5 minutes, and there had to be about 100, at least 100, maybe more people who were very angry, yelling at Mansour. I was trying to very discreetly take some photographs. I got 78 photographs. I know exactly how many I got because I was frustrated I couldn't get more, and not very many of them were very good. And so I kind of slipped out the back as Mansour was saying, we got to get out of here. I got in our Toyota Land Cruiser that we had, and there was a guy in the back, and he gave me the keys. I asked for him. I started the car up to get the air conditioning going. It was about 100 degrees out, and I wanted to cool off. And this young guy comes and jumps in the vehicle, and I can see he's trying to put the shifter into gear. And so I hook his arm, and the guy in the back bails out. He pulls him out of the car onto the ground and jumps in and locks the door. And obviously it was somebody who, if they could have driven the car into the wall and hurt us, I don't think he could have gotten going fast enough to kill us, but he could have hurt us. He would have been a hero amongst this group. So what seemed like an hour was probably about 2 minutes, and finally Angela and Mansour, they come out, and they get in the vehicle, and we leave. When Mansour comes to the airport about 4 or 5 days later when we're leaving, and he says, Howard, I need you to do me a favor. And I said, what's that? And he said, I need some photographs that you took at that child prison. I said, that's no problem. I'll get them to you. He said, I've been to the Minister of Health. I've explained to him what we've seen. And he told me, he says, Mansour, you're making it up. It doesn't exist in this country. You can't find that in this country. So I sent Mansour the photographs, and he took them back to the Minister of Health. And it was pretty hard to deny what he had in his hand. And so the minister agreed to look into it. The outcome, which may sound a little discouraging, but it's a beginning, is that there's a doctor that visits these young boys at least once a week now. They're probably not out of their shackles, and they're probably not unchained, but this photograph exposed it. There's someone who cares enough to take the risk to challenge it, and I think it's the first chip in the wall. And I think eventually the fact that it's been exposed, not only are they in a little better situation now, not significantly, but they will certainly be, I think, down the road in a completely different situation, and that's basically due to the photographs that we were able to provide. Now, one other example I want to give you is that about 3 years ago, my mom and I went to northern Ghana, and I sent her some photographs after we got back from the trip, very similar to the one you saw of the guinea worm, of the worm being pulled out of the foot. And Pam Buffett might have already left because I can't see a thing up here because I have these bright lights in my face. And she might have already left, but she was there when my mom got these photographs, and Pam asked her about them and the background and the history, and Pam sent a check for $25,000 to World Vision to drill 2 wells, which pretty much says that there's probably somewhere close to 1,000 people today just from that $25,000 that no longer have to face the potential consequences of any of those diseases I showed you from having contaminated water. So that picture was worth $25,000 as far as I'm concerned. And oftentimes, I don't know, I take a lot of pictures. There's some photographers here who will relate to this. I came home with 8,000 images from my last trip last week, and I probably pulled out 40 or 50 that I'm going to put over here that are worth saving for when the time comes that I need them. So I don't know whether it's a good photograph or the $25,000 photograph when I take it, but I keep taking them because I believe that there's that opportunity that the right kind of photograph can have some kind of impact. Now, the one thing that I do want to kind of end on is just giving you the other side of the experiences of doing this, which is something that I had to pick one example, and so I picked one in Romania. And this is Vasil and Elena, and this was a time, it doesn't look too cold out, but that's just because they don't have enough clothes. It was pretty cold out. It was getting ready to rain the next day, and I was looking for somebody with a horse and steel plow like this to photograph, and we finally found him. We couldn't find anybody. And they told us the reason they were so late to the field was because they both had different health problems, and they explained all this through an interpreter. And the long and the short of it was that they weren't going to get their plowing done probably before the weather changed on them. So I asked them, I said, well, why can't you just get one of these little tractors that we've seen around here? Can't you hire one of those? And she told me earlier that I had asked them what does a hectare of ground cost, and it was $50, so about $21 an acre. And I then asked why they couldn't get this tractor to help them. And she said, well, it would cost. First, they looked a little stunned, like, why would I ask that question? And then she explained that it would cost $50 to have their 1.5 hectares plowed. So I thought, boy, from an economic standpoint, that is unbelievable. You can buy a piece of land for $50 and it costs you $50 to plow it. That makes no sense. But there wasn't any way they could afford it. So I gave them the $50, which obviously had absolutely no effect on my life, one way or the other. And it was the greatest gift I've ever given anybody for $50. These people, I can't explain to you how excited they were and how thrilled they were that they had somebody who'd come along and that would care enough to do it. And little did they know that it wasn't any kind of a sacrifice for me at all. But it's those kind of experiences that come in between all the other experiences that really, I think, make this worthwhile and worth doing. And you run across. I've got to close with an image that is one that kind of sums up all of the fun times, and that is, I will tell you that the one thing that has just been amazing to me as I've traveled across the world, and I've gone into some pretty tough situations, and the people that you meet. They bring you into their homes. They offer you more than they can afford to offer. And they do it genuinely, and they do it because they want you to have it. And they don't ask questions about who you are or what you think or anything else, but they just accept you. And it's an amazing thing that all across the world, it's the same thing. I mean, whether you're this is in Romania as well, but whether you're in Romania or Africa, it's just amazing. Angela and I were in a little tent in Ethiopia in the middle of nowhere, and the chief has us come in, and brings in his family, and they're so thrilled we're there and we're visiting him. And he's apologizing about how he's very sorry they're at war with the tribe next door, so he really feels badly, but he can't sacrifice a goat for us that day. And Angela and I are thinking, that's okay, we'll come back and have it later. But, I mean, this is the chief that has people starving in his village, but he really wants to do that for us, and if he could have, he would have. So that's one of the most amazing things. And I think, to close this out, because I hope I have a few minutes for questions, it's one of those things where I think the mistake that's often made is that you feel that whatever you're going to do isn't enough or can't make a difference. And I can tell you that it can make a difference. Just a $50 bill in that case in Romania made a huge difference in somebody's life. And so I wouldn't look at it that way. I wouldn't look at it in terms of, what are our means or your means or my means. I would look at it and ask the question, what are their needs and what can I do? And I think if you look around, you'll be able to find that there's a lot more that you can do. And with that, I would just say that I think all of us can and should throw a starfish back into the ocean. Now, I don't know how fast I'm going to get kicked off the podium here, but Where's UNICEF? Well, I don't know, because I'm not an expert on all those big organizations, but I can tell you that there are. You're going to try to make me sit down, aren't you? See, Jeff told me. Jeff. Okay, Mr. Parrott. Oh, that's Jimmy Buffett. See, Jeff thinks I'm so old I can't stand up, so I have to sit down. I'm an easier target this way. I have a bad back. That's why he's telling me to sit down. You know, I got to tell you this, and this is not a pitch, but I'm gonna get off track a little bit. But I got to tell you this story. I was trying to go to Ethiopia about 5 years ago, and I was trying to set up a trip to Ethiopia, and I just couldn't do it. And I called the guys at ABC, and they were pretty helpful. But I just, you know, I didn't want to land in Ethiopia and not be pretty sure that I had the right kind of vehicle and I had the right kind of people, and I knew it was going to happen. So I called Jane Olson, and she was going to go on the trip with me. Jane and I travel together sometimes. And she said, well, I think you ought to call my friend Angela Mason. I said, well, okay, who's Angela? She's with World Vision. I said, I'm not calling World Vision or Save the Children or anybody else. I said, I don't want anything to do with some big organization. And Jane promptly scolded me and said, call Angela. So I called Angela. Long story short, went with Angela first trip 4 or 5 years ago to Ghana, and I've been to probably 12 or 14 countries with her since. And I'm trying to answer your question a little different way. I think what I learned was big organizations are hard to understand. It's hard to know what they do all the time. It's hard to know what impact they have. But it's probably like anything else. It comes down to the individuals and the people. And I would write Angela whatever check I could afford to write, because I know that she will make sure that it gets spent where it's going to count and where it works and where it changes lives. And that's really what you're talking about trying to do. So I think the answer to that is I don't know where UNICEF is in all this. I'm sure they have a huge impact and plenty of it positive. But what it really comes down to is the dedication of tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of individuals who really care about other people and trying to make lives better in changing circumstances. So, you know, it's really hard to say what organization does what. You know, I'm sure they all have good people doing good things, and I'm sure in some of them, you know, they all have money that gets wasted, and that's always a challenge.
We need you to raise your hands and speak to the mic because we're recording it.
Now, don't ask me anything really tough because, you know, don't embarrass me.
I've also been to some countries where people are in bad conditions, and one of the things that's always happened is either you encounter a lot of begging or you encounter a lot of people who see that you're from a wealthier country and, you know, are dying for your business. And I'm just wondering how you personally have handled that situation, the begging and the massive amounts of people who want something from you as an outsider.
Well, I don't think there's any good way to deal with it. You know, sometimes you give them a little bit of money and sometimes you don't. Depends on the circumstances. But the one thing I have learned is when you go into countries where they haven't started that or they do very little of it, you don't want to encourage it. When you go through Uganda, for example, you have a lot of kids that ask you for pens instead of money. The pen's a pretty productive thing, a lot more productive than they're begging for money. So when I go to Uganda, I pack a bunch of pens if I can fit them in with all my camera equipment and film. And so, you know, I think that's a great question because you can take a whole generation of kids and teach them something that you don't want to teach them by encouraging behavior. And at the same time, you see these conditions that are really hard to turn your back on. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think you try to determine every case individually, and if you can help somebody and you feel that by giving them something you are helping them and it makes sense to do it, you do it. And a lot of times you'll get in a situation where, probably more what you're talking about, where you know that people are trying to take advantage of you and they're just trying to milk you for whatever they can get. And in those situations, you know, you just say no and you turn away and you don't give them anything. But it's a good question because you run into it everywhere.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bachman. I met you earlier. I work with the Child Labor and the Global Village Photojournalism Project. You dealt with the UNICEF question. I wondered if you could answer the question about government aid. You brought up the amount by which government official development assistance has come down over the last decade. And yet, you also talked about governments and leaders, corrupt governments and leaders who are starting wars or cheating people of health care and so on. So how do you reconcile, or how do you find the good people like Angela who are working in government, or how do you deal with the problem of corrupt governments?
Who gave Sarah that microphone? That's a pretty tough question. Well, first of all, you know, there are a lot of things in our policy in this country that we could do so differently, and we could do it easily. And I don't know, somebody asked me earlier, how do you get government leadership to change what our policies are? And I mean, everybody in this room knows the only way you can do that is through the political process, and it's a very frustrating, slow process, and a lot of times you don't get the results you want, but we still have one of the better political systems in the world. So, you know, I can think of what we could do just in our agricultural policy in terms of our USDA Farm Policy Bill, PL 250, and the impact it's had. I mean, for instance, the Dole McGovern Lunch Program, I think in 2002, had $300 million in the program, and in 2004 had $50 million. That's a simple matter of funding, okay? That program works. I mean, you get that, you know, I'm not going to say that every dollar is spent right, but that kind of program works. You go into a country where you have malnourished children and people are living on $1 or $2 a day, and you say you come to school and you get a lunch that is nourishing, gives you vitamins and all the things that you're supposed to get that day, kids show up. So they show up and they get a meal, they show up and they get an education, and probably one of the most important aspects of it in terms of what I read is that you will have a way higher percentage of young girls that show up, that their parents let them go to school instead of keeping them home for other reasons, for work reasons and other reasons. They get to school because they're going to get a meal. Now that's significant, because if you ask me, no one asked me this yet, but I'm going to tell you. If you ask me what's the single most important thing you can do to address many of these issues that I showed on the screen, it's the empowerment of women, young women and women, because that will solve or help to begin to address, not solve, many of the issues. So you take just a program like that, it had $300 million, 2 years later it has $50 million. We could fund that program. We can fund billions of dollars to invade Iraq. We can fund that program. It's a matter of priorities and choices. So how do you do that? I think you have to put pressure on the people that can vote yes and put the money in. And that's not a very satisfactory answer because it's not so easy to do. But the same thing, the World Food Program, I'm not great at remembering numbers exactly, but it's a very similar thing. They had about 10 times as much money committed a few years ago for 16 African countries in one of their programs, and they're down to about 40 million in five. No, it's not even 40 million. It's less than that. Maybe 20 million in 5 countries. I mean, you can't just throw money at a problem. But I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of issues that need money and they don't get the money. So that is one answer to it. In terms of corrupt governments, that's something that nobody's quite figured out in their lifetime. And when I think of that, I always think of our family spends a lot of time in South Africa. We have a project there, and I'm there now at least 4 months out of the year. And 3 years ago, Zimbabwe was the poster child of what you could do in conservation. And today, it's an absolute disaster because of one individual. And people are suffering. People are dying. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Now, there's some not so politically correct ways of dealing with it. There's some there's some ways that aren't very acceptable to a lot of people, particularly in a democracy in this country, of dealing with it. But at some point, somebody's going to make the choice. You got one individual that's inflicting an incredible amount of harm, and we're going to do something about it. And you do it in a way that probably, isn't your first choice, but you may not have a lot of options. But if you don't move on it, there's no way to deal with it. So to me, it gets me into another thing that I get a little bit passionate about, which is our pick and choose foreign policy, because we don't care about Mugabe and the people in Zimbabwe. We don't care about the people in Sudan. And I say that because if we really cared about them, we'd be doing more than we're doing. But, we will go invade Iraq. And, I'm not telling you whether I think we went into Iraq was right or wrong. I'm just telling you we have a policy that how can you think that the world can understand what we do? How could you understand that, particularly if you're in Zimbabwe or you're in Sudan? So, I wish I could answer your question better, but there are pieces of it, and you have to take those pieces, whether it's a piece like that funding, and you do what you can do individually, you organize support, and you try to make people move. You try to make a move on their position, you try to make a move on their vote. It's a frustrating, slow process, but it's the only way I know to do it. But it is a case where it does need money, and there's resources in this country, whether it's financial or whether it's ag-related in terms of what we could do, and it's all interconnected. The European Union wants us in the WTO negotiations to drop our PL 250 program, our Food for Peace program, before we eliminate some of our other export subsidies. That's crazy, and I hope we never do it. But it overlaps into trade issues and trade negotiations and all sorts of things. So it gets really complex, and there's probably people here that understand it better than I do. But it's not an easy thing to answer.
Howard, last question. One last. There you go.
Yes, hi. My name is Julie Pudlowski. I'm a PhD student and a photographer. And I'm a strong believer in also photography to harness awareness. And I'm just coming back from an 8-month mission in Rwanda where I worked for the UN. The name of the forest we're looking for was Gishwati. But anyway, I'm talking now. I was just a little shocked by a few photos I've seen, and I'd like to hear your comments. We talked in France about the pornography of poverty and the way we depict people in developing countries. I feel that some photos are really powerful, and some other just really perpetuate the Western myth of savage developing countries. I can think of the photo of this child defecting on the street. I'm not sure whether it really brings something new. And I was just pretty shocked by it. You talked about the dignity of subjects. I feel that the subjects are losing total dignity in certain photos. So my question to you is, what is the purpose of some photos except shocking certain people? And the second question is, why don't you work with UN agencies, relief organizations, people that are specialized in that type of work, relief? And I do believe that photo is a really strong tool to raise awareness, but at the same time, people need to be empowered to make decisions and know what they can actually do. And some photos just leave us powerless and just thinking, my God, those people are savage. And we're educated. And I felt that at a country, I learned a lot from developing countries. And it's really an exchange both ways. And I just saw our way of looking at those people. Sorry, it was a little long.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer that. I wasn't sure I got all of it. But I think the truth is that some of the images are simply there to try to, I mean, you can use the term shock or whatever, but it's to get people's attention. And we had a conversation about this the other night because maybe to your point, sometimes what you can do is you can use images in a way that are so powerful. Well, this came up this afternoon too. I mean, you can use images in a way that are powerful in the sense that you're describing it enough that they just turn people off, and that people turn away from it because they're too grotesque or they're too difficult to understand or they make them uncomfortable. And I think that's probably true. I don't know, each photographer is going to try to make a decision on their own in terms of what message they're trying to give or what they're trying to project and what images are going to do that the best. I think that, you could criticize me for a presentation like this by saying you show all these pictures and these images and then, so what's next? And I don't know what the answer is what's next, except that I know that the only thing I know I can do is that I can show these images and I can tell you the stories behind them and I can tell you my experiences, and hopefully that does move some people to say, I think I need to do more, or I need to do something. It certainly can have the other impact. I don't doubt that. But I can only do so much as one individual, and that's what I've chosen to do, right or wrong. In terms of some of the images, if I understood this right, that maybe leave you thinking some of the countries are savage or just, did I get that right? Yeah. There's an element of that I think is reality. And there may be people who don't like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it because I think it's the truth. And that is, and Africa has more of this on a continent than probably most other continents. You've got to help yourself before you can expect other people to truly help you. And, about half the countries in Africa at any given time are at war with each other, one way or the other. There's some kind of conflict. It's brutal. I mean, it is brutal, and it is savage. Now, that may be the choices of some leadership, and that may be the choices of some government and just a few individuals. But as Richard said today at lunch, he described it differently than I would, but in the Congo there's like 10 different countries fighting, and they have been. And if you ask a friend of mine, Annette Langeau, she'll give you the numbers, and they're unbelievable when you talk about those who have been killed and mutilated and orphaned and everything else in the last 10 years in that area. But nobody knows about it, and nobody cares about it. And so the answer is, if I show images that some people come away thinking, well, that's pretty savage, that's pretty brutal, I hate to tell you, that's the way it is. And so I'm not so much for supporting the people that are obviously causing that, but it does leave a lot of people that need a lot of help. And I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm trying, but it's the reality. It's the facts. The idea is not to say all these people here or there or somewhere else are so brutal that or savage that we're not going to deal with them or we don't want to help them. The idea is to realize and expose and educate the fact that this is happening in the world, and somehow people have to get moved to the point where in this country, what's going on, they've been killing people in Sudan for years, but now all of a sudden it's a hot spot. So whether you pick that or you pick something else, either we're going to provide the resources and the support because we believe in principle, and we have to have the right process to do it, okay? The right process is not invading a country, and I don't know that the UN is effective, and I'm not going to get into that debate. So the process has to be right. I'm not going to define the process right now. But, we have to decide what are our principles, what are our core values, and are we willing to make it a priority that when people in other parts of the world have no one else that's going to come to their defense, are we going to do that? Now, that's a big question to answer, and there's all sorts of implications. But you got to know what you're dealing with before you answer that question. And the truth is that in certain parts of the world, you're dealing with some pretty brutal people that really don't care much about life, and life is very meaningless. So I can tell Jeff's ready to pull me off. I don't know if I answered your question. The idea is not to have people come away thinking those are savage people. The idea is to come away realizing that there are other people in the world doing things that are unacceptable, and we need to do something so that more people and more places don't have those circumstances occur. Now, there's other people with their hands up, Jeff.
Well, they're going to have a chance to talk with you upstairs again. But I want to say the last part of your question was, aren't there ways of encouraging support for important things that are going on? And I don't know if you heard the part of Howie's talk where he talked about World Vision. That's one group that he contributes to and believes. He said he would do anything he can to support World Vision and the work that they're doing. Angela Mason's here in the front row. Maybe you could stand up, Angela, so people who want to talk to you later can talk to you. But that's not just to promote that one.
Applaud Angela. She's about killed me 20 times. Or gotten me killed.
But that just happens to be one group. At lunch today, we had a number of other groups here talking about what they can do, and certainly the governmental groups are enormously
now, Jeff,
important.
Will you let me say one thing so that I don't leave this room with someone misunderstanding something? I'm sorry. But I want to say one thing because I thought about this after, the comments that I made on Africa. I want everybody to realize I love Africa. I've invested in Africa. I have a big investment in Africa personally. I have great friends there. So when I use the example as Africa as the different warring factions, or Congo as an example, I would never want that to be misinterpreted as to my view of that continent. I think that continent has incredible culture, incredible history, and probably more to offer the world if it could be developed right. And I wouldn't want to walk out of this room with people thinking that, because I used part of that as an example, that I have some predisposed idea. I love Africa, so I just want to make
Well, and
that
there's been a lot of brutality in Europe and in the United States,
that's exactly
too.
right. That's exactly right.
I want to acknowledge the Armory once again, and Scott Ward, who's here, is executive producer, and Jay Bellotti, who is the curator and director of Gallery Program, who curated the wonderful exhibit upstairs. I want to make sure that everybody knows that you're invited to return to the second floor to the exhibit for further conversation, to look at the photos. There's a little bit more refreshments up there, and there's a chance to talk individually. If you had your hands up, there'll be a chance to talk with Howie and with Angela and others up there. And finally, we didn't want to give this out before the talk, but I would like to tell you that we have copies of this brochure available for everybody, and it's a brochure that has a lot of images, it has very few words, and the words tell an incredible story, as do the images, and I'd urge you all to look at it. At 8 o'clock, we are going to return here for a film that I'm told is an absolutely magnificent film called Forgiveness, about South Africa, and based on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a film that was had its first exhibit in the Toronto Film Festival last week, and we'll be having the American premiere here tonight at 8 o'clock. For all that you do and for being with us tonight and for these magnificent pictures, I'd like to thank Howie Buffett. Thank you so much.